John Gill's Exposition of the entire Bible, brought to you by Discovering the Scriptures, being read by Dr. Peter John. We are in Nahum, chapter 2. Introduction to Nahum, chapter 2. This chapter gives an account of the destruction of the city of Nineveh, describes the instruments of it as very terrible and powerful, and not to be resisted. Nahum, chapter 2, verse 1. The manner of taking it, the flight of its inhabitants, and the spoil of its riches and treasures, Nahum 2:5, and the king and princes thereof compared to a lion and a lion's whelp, are insulted as being without a den or a dwelling place because of their cruelty and ravaging, for which the Lord was against them, and threatened them with utter ruin, which he brought upon them. Nahum chapter 2, verse 11. End of the introduction to Nahum chapter 2. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 1. This is the exposition of the entire Bible, verse by verse, brought to you by Discovering the Scriptures with Dr. Peter John. So reading from the King James Bible, quote, "He that dashes in pieces has come up before thy face. Keep the munition, watch the way. Make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily," unquote. John Gill, quote, "He that dashes in pieces has come up before thy face. O Nineveh, O land of Assyria, for this is not to be understood as Sennacherib coming up against Jerusalem, as Kimshi, but of Nebuchadnezzar against Nineveh, as Aben Ezra, not Nebuchadnezzar the Great, who the Jewish chronologers say took Nineveh the first year of his reign, but his father, Nebuchadnezzar the first, called Nabopolassar, that's Nabopolassar, who with Cyaxares or Ahasuerus, the Mede, joined their forces against Nineveh and took it. See the Apocrypha in Tobit 14:15. Quote, "But before he died, he heard the destruction of Nineveh, which was taken by Nabuchodonosor and Assuerus. And before his death, he rejoiced over Nineveh, Nineve." Talbot chapter 14, verse 15, unquote. And these together, the Chaldeans and Medes, were the dasher in pieces, or the hammer, as the word may be rendered, and so Babylon, over which one of these kings reigned, is called the hammer of the whole earth. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 23. These came up openly, boldly, in the face of the king of Assyria, attacked him in his metropolis, and not fearing his strength and numbers. Keep the munition. This and what follow are spoken ironically of the Assyrian king and inhabitants of Nineveh, to take care of their towers and garrisons, and fortify them, and fill them with soldiers, and watch the way in which the enemy came, secure the passes and avenues that lead to their city, stop their march, and prevent his access. Make thy loins strong, put on armor, gird on the sword, prepare for war. Fortify thy power mightily, increase thy army, exert all thy strength and courage, and do all that is within thy power to do, to oppose the enemy and defend thyself, and when all is done, it will be in vain." Unquote. Scripture quote, "He that dashes in pieces has come up before thy face. Keep the munition, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily." Unquote. End of Nahum chapter 2, verse 1. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 2. Reading from the King James Bible, quote, "For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers have emptied them out and marred their vine branches." Unquote. John Gill, quote, "For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel," or "will render a recompense for," or "revenge the pride of Jacob, all that insolency and those injuries done in a proud and haughty manner by Sennacherib king of Assyria to the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, invading their land, taking their fenced cities, and besieging their metropolises, and in an audacious manner threatening them with utter destruction unless they surrendered, and also by Shalmaneser, that's Shalmaneser, another king of Assyria, who had besieged and took Samaria, the capital city of Israel, or the 10 tribes, and had carried them captive. And now Assyria, though it had been the rod of God's anger and the instrument of his chastisement and corruption of his people, must in its turn suffer and smart for all this. For the emptiers have emptied them out. The Assyrians, partly by their extractions and tribunes they demanded, and partly by their spoil and plunder, has stripped Israel and Judah of all, or the greatest part of their substance, wealth, and treasure, and marred their vine branches, their children, their sons and daughters, slaying them or carrying them captive. Israel and Judah are often compared to a vine, and so the prosperity to branches or corrupted them with superstition and idolatry. The Targum interprets it of their own renowned cities, these and towns and villages being to the land as branches to the vine, and which have been ransacked and pillaged by the Assyrians, and now they should be paid in their own coin. Scripture quote, "For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers have emptied them out and marred their vine branches." Unquote. King James Version. End of Nahum chapter 2, verse 2. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 3. First reading from the King James Bible, quote, "The shield of his mighty men is made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariot shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the fir trees shall be terribly shaken," unquote. John Gill, quote, "The shield of his mighty men is made red. The shields of the soldiers in the armies of the Babylonians and Medes, those dashers and pieces that would come up against Nineveh, should be red, either with the blood of the slain, or thus colored on purpose to inject terror to their enemies, or this may express the luster of them which being gilded or made of gold or brass, in the rays of the sun glittered and looked of a fierce red." See the Apocrypha in 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 39. Quote, "Now when the sun shone upon the shields of gold and brass, the mountains glistered therewith, and shone like lamps of fire," unquote. 1 Maccabees 6:39. The valiant men are in scarlet. The generals and other officers of the army were clothed in scarlet, partly to show their greatness and nobleness, and partly to strike their enemies with terror, and to hide their blood should they be wounded, and so keep up their own spirits, and not encourage their enemies. The chariot shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, that is, when the Medes and Chaldeans under their respective commander or commanders shall prepare for the siege of the city, and to make their onset and attack upon it. The chariots used by them in war, which was common in those times, would have flaming torches in them, either to guide them in the night, or to set fire to houses and tents they should meet with, or to terrify the enemy. Or the chariots shall be as flaming torches. They should run with such swiftness that the wheels, being of iron or cased with it, should strike fire upon the stones in such quantities that they should look like torches flaming. And the fir trees shall be terribly shaken with the motion of the chariots, or this may be interpreted of spears and lances and such like instruments of war, made of fir, which should be in such great numbers and with so much activity used against the Ninevites that it would look like shaking a forest of fir trees. The Targum interprets these are the great men and generals of their armies, glittering in dyed garments, and Kimchi's father of the princes and the great men of the city of Nineveh, who would be seized with terror and reel about like drunken men. And so all that follows in the next verse, Nahum 2, verse 4. Reading from the King James Bible, quote, "The shield of his mighty men is made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariot shall be in flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the fir trees shall be terribly shaken," unquote. End of John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 3. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 4. Reading from the King James Bible first, quote, "The chariot shall rage in the streets. They shall jostle one against another in the broad ways. They shall seem like torches. They shall run like the lightnings. Unquote. John Gill, quote, the chariot shall rage in the streets of Nineveh when taken, where they shall be drove in a furious manner from place to place, the men in them breathing out slaughter and death wherever they came. Kimchi understands this of the chariots of the Ninevites, who shall drive about in them in the streets of the city like madmen, not daring to go out to fight the enemy, being mightier and more numerous than they. They shall jostle one against another in the broad ways, because of their numbers and the haste they shall make to spoil and plunder the city. Or the Ninevites shall jostle one against another in their hurry and confusion to make their escape. They shall seem like torches, either the chariots of the Medes or Chaldeans, for the reason given in the preceding verse, Nahum chapter 2, verse 3, or they themselves, because of their fierceness and cruelty, or in the faces of the Ninevites, being covered with shame. So Kimchi, see Isaiah chapter 13, verse 8. They shall run like the lightnings, exceedingly swiftly, with irresistible force and power. The above writer interprets this of the Ninevites also running from one end of their city to the other in the utmost confusion, not knowing what to do, but the whole of these two verses, Nahum 2:3, seem to be a description of their enemies. Unquote. Scripture, quote, the chariot shall rage in the streets. They shall jostle one against another in the broad ways. They shall seem like torches. They shall run like the lightnings. Unquote. End of John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 4. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 5. Reading from the King James Bible first, quote, he shall recount his worthiness. They shall stumble in their walk. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, and the defense shall be prepared. Unquote. John Gill, quote, he shall recount his worthies, either the dasher in pieces, Nahum 2:1, the kings of Babylon and Media shall call together their general officers and muster the forces under them, and put them in mind of their duty, and recount the actions of their ancestors in former times, in order to animate and encourage them to the siege and attack of the city of Nineveh. Or the king of Assyria shall recount and muster up his nobles and the troops under them, to sally out against the enemy and meet him in the field and give him battle. They shall stumble in their walk, being many, and in haste to obey the orders of their commander, shall stumble and fall upon one another, or else the Ninevites in their march out against the enemy shall be discomforted, and flee before him, or be dispirited and flee back again. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, of Nineveh, that is, the Medes and the Chaldeans shall make haste thither and break it down or scale it. Or the Ninevites, falling in their sally out, shall betake themselves in all haste to the city walls, and defend themselves under the protection of them. And the defense shall be prepared, or the covering, the word, used has the signification of a booth or tent. To cover and protect, here it signifies something that was prepared, either by the besiegers, to cover them from the darts and stones of the besieged, as they make their approaches to the walls, or which the besieged cover themselves with from the assaults of the besiegers, rather than the former. Unquote. Reading Scripture, quote, he shall recount his worthies. They shall stumble in their walk. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, and the defense shall be prepared. Unquote. End of John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 5. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 6. Reading first from the King James Bible, quote, the gates of the river shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. Unquote. John Gill, quote, the gates of the river shall be opened, of Diavia, that's D-I-A-V-A, and Adavia, A-D-I-A-V-A, or Lyska, that's L-Y-C-U-S, and Cuprus, that's C-A-P-R-U-S, between which, according to some writers, Nineveh was situated, or the gates of the city which lay nearest to the river Tigris are meant, or that river itself, the plural for the singular, which overtaking broke down the walls of the city for 2.5 miles, and opened a way for the Medes and Chaldeans to enter in, of which see Nahum chapter 1, verse 8. And the palace shall be dissolved by the inundations, or destroyed by the enemy, meaning the palace of the king, which might be situated near the river, or the temple of Nisroch, Nisroch, the Syrian deity, or Juniper Belus, Belus, for the same word signifies a temple as well as palace. Unquote. Scripture, quote, the gates of the river shall be open, and the palace shall be dissolved. Unquote. End of John Gill's Nahum chapter 2 verse 6. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2 verse 7. Reading from the King James Bible first. And Hephzibah, that's Huzzab, will be led away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maid shall lead her as the voice of doves, tambourine upon her breast. Unquote. And Hephzibah shall be led captive. The Targum translates it, the queen, and Jarki and Aben Ezra, after our Samuel, take it to be the same of the queen of Assyria, so called, and as every queen might, from her standing at the king's right hand. Psalms 45 verse 9. Who, when the royal palace was destroyed, was taken out and carried captive with the rest, who before was in a well-settled and tranquil state and condition, or perhaps the king himself is designed, who may be represented as a woman, as follows, for his effeminacy, conversing only with women, imitating their voice, wearing their apparel, and doing their work, spinning, which is the character historians give of the last king of the Assyrians. Some take it to be the idol Venus, worshipped by the Ninevites, though it may be meant either of the palace itself, as Kimchi's father, which was firm and well established, or rather Nineveh itself, thought to be stable and secure, the inhabitants of which should be carried into a strange land. She shall be brought up, the queen or the king, out of the palace or private retirement, where they were in peace and safety. Or Nineveh and the inhabitants of it are out of a secure state and condition. And her maids shall lead her, her maids of honor supporting her on the right hand and left, ready to sink and faint under her misfortunes. This may also be understood of towns and villages and of the inhabitants of them that should go into captivity along the Ninevites. As with the voice of doves tambourine upon her breast, mourning like doves inwardly and secretly, not daring to express their sorrow more publicly because of their enemies, but knocking and beating upon their breast as men do upon tambourines or drums, thereby expressing the inward grief of their minds. See Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 16, unquote. Scripture quote, and Hephzibah shall be led away captive, she shall be brought up, and her maids shall lead her as with the voice of doves, tambourine upon her breasts, unquote. End of Nahum chapter 2 verse 7, John Gill. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2 verse 8. Reading first from the King James Bible, quote, but Nineveh is of old like the pool of water, yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, but none shall look back, unquote. John Gill, quote, but Nineveh is of old like a pool of water. This was a very ancient city built by Nimrod, as some say, or rather by Ashur, Ashur, as appeared from Genesis 10:10. And it was like fish pool full of people, as it was in the times of Jonah, who for their number may be compared both to water and to fish, and likewise full of wealth and riches, which for their instability may be signified by water also, and moreover like a pool of standing water, had neither been liable to any commotion or disturbances, but had remained from the beginning in a tranquil and prosperous state. Besides, some regard may be had in a literal sense in its situation, being watered by the river Tigris, and which was for its profit and defense. So some copies of the Septuagint read the words, quote, Nineveh is like a pool of water. The waters are her walls, unquote. And the Syriac version is, quote, Nineveh is as a lake of water and is among the waters, unquote. See Nahum chapter 1 verse 6. Yet they shall flee away. The waters out of the pool, the sludges shall be open, and the banks broken down, or the people out of the city. Breaches being made in its walls, and its gates opened, and the enemy entering, when everyone would flee for his life, making his escape in the best manner he could. Stand, stand, shall they cry, either the generals or officers of the king of Assyria army, to the soldiers running away, or the more courageous inhabitants of the city, to those that are timorous and seized with a panic, fleeing in the utmost consternation, or the enemy as Kimchi, who shall call to them to stop, promising to spare their lives upon a surrender of them to them. but none shall look back and stand to hear what is said unto them, but make the best of their way and flee with all their might and main. Unquote. Scripture quote, but Nineveh is of an old like pool of water, yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, but none shall look back. Unquote. End of Nineveh, chapter 2, verse 8. John Gill, Nahum, chapter 2, verse 9. Reading from the King James Bible, quote, take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is none end of the store and glory out of all the pleasant furniture. Unquote. John Gill, quote, take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, of which there was a great quantity in this rich and populous city. These are the words of the prophet, or of the Lord by the prophet, to the Medes and Chaldeans, to seize the spoil of the city, now fallen into their hands, suggesting that this was by the order and will of God, though they saw it not, or of the generals of the army of the Medes and Babylonians, giving lead to the common soldiers to take part of the plunder, there being enough for them all, officers and private men. For there is none end of the store and glory out of all the pleasant furniture, no end of the wealth which had been hoarded up, and of their household good and rich apparel, which their coffers, houses, and wardrobes were full of, the value of which could not be told. The king of Assyria, perceiving that he, his family, and his wealth were alike to fall into the hands of the enemy, caused the pile of wood to be raised, and in it heaped his gold, silver, and royal apparel, and enclosing himself, his eunuchs, and his concubines in it, set fire to it, and destroyed himself and them. It is said there, no less in this pile than 1,000 mitres of talents of gold, which are about 1,400 million sterling, and 10 times as many talents of silver, together with apparel and furniture unspeakable. And yet, after all this, the princes of the Babylonians and Medes carried off vast quantities. The Babylonian prince loaded several ships with the ashes of the pile, and a large quantity of gold and silver, discovered to him by a eunuch, a deserter, and the Median prince what of the gold and silver left out of the pile, which were many talents, and fell into his hands, he sent to Ecbatana, the royal city of Media. Unquote. Scripture quote, take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is none end of the store and glory out of all the pleasant furniture. Unquote. End of Nahum chapter 2, verse 9. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 10. Reading first from the King James Bible, quote, she is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. Unquote. John Gill, quote, she is empty and void and waste, the city of Nineveh, empty of inhabitants, being killed or having fled, and stripped of all its treasures and riches by the enemies, its walls and houses demolished and pulled down, and laid in ruins, it became a heap of rubbish. See Gill on Nahum chapter 1, verse 8. Various words are here used to ascertain and confirm the thing, and there is an elegant play on words or likeness of sounds, which our language will not express. And the heart melteth, and the heart of every inhabitant of Nineveh melted with fear at the approach of their enemies. Their entrance into the city, and the plunder of it, flowed like water, or melted like wax. See Psalms chapter 22, verse 14. And the knees smite together, like people in a fright, and when a panic has seized them, and as it was with Belshazzar, Daniel chapter 5, verse 6, and much pain is in all loins, like that of women in travail, or of persons in a sudden fright, which gives them a pain in their backs at once, and the faces of them all gather blackness, like a pot, as the Targum adds, being in great distress and disconsolation, which make men appear in a dismal hue, and their countenances look very dark and gloomy. See Joel chapter 2, verse 6. Unquote. Scripture quote, she is emptied and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. Unquote. End of John Gill's Nahum chapter 2, verse 10. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 11. Reading first from the King James Bible, quote, where is the dwelling of the lions, and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion, even the old lion, walked, and the lion's whelps and none made them afraid, unquote. John Gill, quote, where is the dwelling of the lions, or the kings of Assyria, comparable to lions for the strength, courage, and cruelty, tyranny, and oppression, such as Pul, and then Tiglathpileser, and Shalmaneser, and Sennacherib. So the Targum, where are the inhabitants of the kings? These are the words either of the prophet or the people that had seen this city in its glory, and now see it in its ruins, so desolate and waste, so that it could scarcely be said where it once stood. And the feeding place of the young lions, the sons of the kings of Assyria, the princes of the blood, and who were of the same blood, temper, and disposition of their ancestors, and were born, brought up, and educated in Nineveh, the royal city. So the Targum, and the dwelling houses of the princes, or governors, where the lion, even the old lion, walked, not Nebuchadnezzar as Jerome, who entered into Nineveh, the den of those lions, or seat of the Assyrians, and took it, and walked about in it as the conquerors and possessors of it, but rather Nimrod, that old lion and tyrant. If he was the first founder of the city, as some say, though it does not seem so much to design any particular person, but the kings of Assyria in general, even the most cruel and savage as the old lion is, so the Targum in the plural number, whither the kings went, and the lions whelped, and none made them afraid. There were none to resist their power, curb their insolency, and put a stop to their cruelty and oppression, or make them afraid of pursuing such methods. The Targum is, there they leave their children, even as a lion that continues in hunting with confidency, and there is none that terrifies them, unquote. Scripture, quote, where is the dwelling of the lions, and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion, even the old lion, walked, and the lions whelps, and none made them afraid, unquote. End of John Gill's Nahum chapter 2, verse 11. John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 12. Reading first from the King James Bible, quote, the lion did tear in pieces enough for his whelps, and strangled for his lionesses, and filled his holes with prey, and his dens with raven, unquote. John Gill, quote, the lion did tear in pieces enough for his whelps. The metaphor is still continued, and the kings of Assyria are compared to lions that hunt for their prey, and having found it, tear it in pieces, carry home a sufficiency for their whelps. It is a notion that is advanced by some writers. At Herodias, the lioness, the strongest and boldest creature, brings forth but once in its life, and then but one, which Gillius, Gellius, confutes by the testimonies of Homer and Aristotle, and it appears that the prophet here to be a false one, as well as from Ezekiel chapter 19, verse 2. Thus the Assyrians made war on other nations, and pillaged and plundered them, to enlarge their dominions, provide their prosperity, and enrich their children. And strangled for his lioness. That is, strangled of the beast, as the lion first does, then when it seizes a creature, and then tears it in pieces and bring it to the she-lion in the den with its whelps. These lionesses designed the wives and concubines of the kings of Assyria, among whom they parted the spoil of their neighbors, so the Targum. Kings bring wrappings to their wives, and a prey to the children. That is, riches which they have taken from others by force and rapine. Thus Sisera observes of the kings of Persia and Syria, that they had many wives, and gave cities to them after this manner. This city for their headdress, this for the neck, and for the other for the hair, the expenses of them. And filled his holes with prey, and his dens with rapine. As a lion fills his dens and lurking holes with the prey he has seized and ravaged, so the kings of Assyria filled their palaces, treasures, magazines, towers, cities, and towns, with the wealth and riches they took by force from other nations, as the Targum, and they filled their treasures with rapine, and their palaces with spoil, unquote. Scripture, quote, the lion did tear in pieces enough for his whelps, and strangled for his lionesses, and filled his holes with prey, and his dens with ravine, unquote. End of John Gill, Nahum chapter 2, verse 12. John Gill, exposition of the entire Bible, verse by verse, brought to you by Discovering the Scriptures, being read by Dr. Peter John. This is Nahum chapter 2, verse 13, the last verse in chapter 2. Reading first and last from the King James Bible, quote, Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard. Unquote. John Gill, quote, Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, against Nineveh and the whole Assyrian empire. For such rapine, violence, and oppression their kings had been guilty of, and if he, who is the Lord of hosts, of all the armies of heaven and earth, was against them, nothing but ruin must inevitably ensue, or I come unto thee, or will shortly come unto thee and reckon with thee for all this, will visit thee in a way of wrath and vengeance. The Targum is, Behold, I will send my fury upon thee, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, either those in which the inhabitants of Nimrod rode in great splendor about the city, or those which were used in war with their enemies, and this he would do in the smoke, or unto smoke, as the Vulgate Latin version, or into smoke, as the Syriac, easily, quickly, at once, suddenly, so that they should evaporate into smoke and be no more, or with fire, as the Targum, that is, as Kimchi interprets it, with a great fire, whose smoke is seen far off, and may figuratively understood the smoke of the divine wrath, as Ezra explains it. And the sword shall devour thy young lions. The swords of the Medes and Chaldeans shall destroy the princes, the sons of their kings. The Targum interprets this, of towns or villages destroyed thereby. And I will cut their prey from the earth, cut them off, that they should no more prey upon their neighbors, and what they had got should be taken away from them, and be of no use to them. And the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard in foreign courts, demanding homage and subjection, exacting and collecting tribute, blaspheming the God of heaven, and malicing his people, as Rapshaken, a messenger of one of these kings, did, and which is mentioned by the most of the Jewish commentators as being then a recent thing. Some render it the voice or the noise of its jaw teeth, although into the lions breaking the bones of its prey, which is done with great noise, signifying that such cruelty and opposition the Assyrians have been guilty of should be no more. Or rather, as R. Judah ben Balaam's observed, as it signifies the noise of the teeth devouring the prey, as if it said, I will cut off thy prey from the earth. And Ben Milach says that in the Persian language, grinding stones are expressed by this word, and the teeth are called grinders. See Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 3, unquote. Scripture quote, Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke. And the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard. Unquote. King James Version. End of Nahum, chapter 2, verse 13. End of the chapter 2 of Nahum. This is John Gill's exposition of the entire Bible, brought to you by Discovering the Scriptures, being read by Dr. Peter John.